Okay, so first of all, thanks everybody. It's good to kind of connect with you guys again. It's been a few years. And it's always, kind of, fun to talk about entomology and social insects. And I've talked a few times, of course, about ants. I think the last time I was up there, I specifically talked about invasive species broadly. And I thought this time I would just kind of talk about social insects in British Columbia. A little bit about what species we have here that are social, or what groups are social, and also a little bit about the theory of what we mean when we talk about social, or as I'll explain, sort of eusocial insects within the province. Just okay. So just to talk about what it is with respect to the behavior of being social and what we consider as a biologist as an animal society. So we consider societies to be collections of individuals of the same species that reciprocally communicate for the purpose of cooperation in some context which is greater than just reproduction. And the boundary of a society is sort of defined by the limits at which that cooperative communication can occur across. Within biology, we recognize aggregations, which are just sort of accumulations of individuals of the same species with little or no communication. You can sort of imagine a group of tadpoles all clustered at one edge of a pond, and to the best of our knowledge, they're not communicating. The purpose of their aggregation is something else. And it differs from what we call in biology populations, which are defined by interbreeding individuals of the same population. So societies involve this cooperative communication. And when we talk about social, we're talking about really a behavioral attribute. So within a species, cooperative behavior that occurs within a society may be defined as being social. And so humans are social. We communicate for purposes other than simply reproduction. Now, when it comes to insects, many insects are what we refer to as being eusocial, which is sort of a character or a level of social behavior which exceeds that which we're familiar with in humans. So E.O. Wilson, who has done a lot of work in social biology, characterized eusocial insects as having three basic characteristics. That the colonies include members which are reproductive, and others, though, that have limited or no reproductive potential. So only a few members of the colony, and perhaps occasionally only one member of the colony, is capable of reproducing, while all other members are sterile or neuters, in the older language of Charles Darwin. That the adults of more than one generation coexist. So young are reared to adulthood, and more young are reared to adulthood, and those generations overlap within the colony. And that the non-reproductive members of the colony will be responsible for taking care of the young. So this is a level of social behavior, again, which exceeds what we normally associate with human social behavior, but it is characteristic of the eusocial insects. Now, is eusocial behavior successful? Wilson has noted that no major taxon of eusocial animals has ever gone extinct. That is, when eusocial behavior has evolved within that group, while a species might go extinct, that group persists and continues to demonstrate that eusocial behavior. So that's an interesting yardstick, by which to measure success, the fact that when it does develop, it persists. And when it comes to eusocial insects, they comprise about 2% of identified insect species, but 80% of animal biomass in the jungles of South America appear to be in the form of social insects. And the ants alone are 4 times the biomass of all vertebrates in tropical rainforests in South America. Globally, it's estimated that social insects account for approximately 50% of global animal biomass. So this is an extremely successful evolutionary development. And even though species diversity is not enormous, where those species have become eusocial, they've become ubiquitous and found virtually everywhere. So when we think about eusocial insects, they're kind of the big four, three of which are hymenopterans. We've got the ants, the bees, and the wasps. And we also have the termites. Now, we do have some other eusocial insects. There are some aphids and some thrips, which are eusocial. And as well, there's actually an ambrosia beetle in Australia, which is eusocial. And there are certain characteristics which lend species to becoming eusocial. And what I want to do is talk a little bit about that in a while as to what can help kind of pave the path towards what are otherwise solitary animals becoming eusocial. So first of all, just starting with the termites that we have in British Columbia. In BC, we have only 3 native species of termites. And interestingly, we have 1 exotic species, which is actually found in 2 locations, but one of those locations is kind of interesting because they're living inside the cupboards at the Department of Zoology at UBC. And to the best of my knowledge, they have never tried to get rid of them from that particular location. So the termites aren't related to the other eusocial insects, the hymenopterans, ants, the bees, and the wasps. Rather, the termites are actually closely related to cockroaches. And in fact, some of the more classical cockroaches show early social behavior. So it's perhaps not unusual or strange that eusocial behavior developed within that particular group. So other termites that we have here, the one which comes closest to Williams Lake is the Western Subterranean termites. This is the one I was just talking with Ordell about, that opening up a log in Sharon Creek, it came across the Western Subterranean termite. And it turned out that that observation was the highest latitude at which this globally distributed genus has actually been found in the world. And I was noting on the iNaturalist app at some point this summer, there were some postings actually from Alexis Creek, which showed tunnels, which were quite characteristically termite. And I had asked the person actually who had taken those photos if they were able to return this summer and actually verify whether or not there actually were termites that were responsible for what they had observed there. So the Western Subterranean termite, as the name kind of suggests, the main colony is normally found in the soil. And in moist soil, often underneath logs or adjacent to buildings. And the colony will come up from that main mass and occasionally move into buildings or move into woody debris above ground. The Western Subterranean termites has caused a fair bit of structural damage in Kamloops, mostly in the downtown area. So it definitely is a structural risk for people in the Kamloops area. I've never heard of this termite though in Williams Lake itself. With respect to the sort of termite biology, I've got a couple of photos here, and you can see what a queen typically looks like within a termite colony. And what's different about termites as compared to ants, bees, and wasps is that you have a queen, but you normally also have a king within the colony. And they will frequently mate in order to continue to allow the queen to fertilize eggs, which she is producing. But within the queens, the gaster is greatly enlarged, as the ovarioles fill up all of that space, and it's a gigantic sort of egg producing machine. And in the tropics, some of the species of termites, those queens can be up to 10 centimeters in size. They're quite huge. In the photo just to the top here, you can see a queen, just above it, a soldier. And in the photo on the bottom, there's a queen, and just below it, there's a worker. So what's kind of interesting about subterranean termites and termites in general is I've got this schematic here, sort of outlining the reproductive cycle of Reticulotermes termites. And actually, this diagram was put together by Rudolph Schefren at the University of Florida, who actually contacted me about that observation in Sharon Creek. And if you looked at this, you would go, okay, that's the life cycle of a termite. We have a king and a queen. They can produce eggs. The eggs can kind of follow a number of developmental paths. What's interesting in termites is that they can develop into what are called supplementary reproductives, both male and female supplementary reproductives. So if something happens to the queen or something happens to the king, these supplementary reproductives can kind of take over within the colony. And then we have a couple of lines that either develop into workers and soldiers or develop into new sort of reproductives. And so you might look at this and say, okay, well, that's the reproductive life cycle of Reticulotermes, until you look at the literature and you discover that actually nobody agrees on this life cycle at all. There are at least 8 possible concepts out there as to what the actual life cycle of Reticulotermes termites might be. They don't agree on the life cycle, and they don't even agree on the terminology to use for the various nymphs and intermediates within these colonies. So it seems odd, but there's some real fundamentals about termite biology that we still don't actually understand. However, they do typically annually undergo mating flights. In the case of Reticulotermes, it's usually in the fall, but it can also occur in the spring in more northern areas. And the other species of termite that we have in British Columbia, which you wouldn't find close to Williams Lake usually, are dampwood termites. And you usually find these in rotten stumps. That's where I normally come across these. We have Zeutromatopsis nevadensis and Angusticolus within the province. It's always kind of interesting reading literature. These particular termites aren't as complex as Reticulotermes with respect to their life cycle. They don't actually have mature workers within the colonies. It's actually the nymphs, the babies essentially, that actually carry out all the work within the colonies. But it's always interesting to see authors trying to find the right way to describe this, referring to it as primitive or poorly evolved or all sorts of various other terms for this kind of behavior. But the subterranean termites considered highly evolved, and these are considered poorly evolved, even in the scientific literature about the termites. So these are the termites which are genuinely eusocial. And I'll talk just a little later about the conditions that may have given rise to this eusocial behavior within these termites. Because the path to becoming eusocial in termites would have been more difficult than it was for the ants, the bees, and the wasps. And hopefully you'll get a sense of what the difference is between the two. So eusocial behavior or eusociality is generally considered a determinant of what we refer to as a superorganism. It was a term which was originally coined by William Morton Wheeler in 1911. And he kind of conceptualized an ant colony in essence as a physical single body in which the cells weren't physically connected to each other. And they were capable of moving out, through the environment. And hence, when we think about how an ant colony or a beehive functions, we're kind of thinking about it being a single organism, which is just not physically connected all of the time. We coordinate our cells within our own bodies, using extensive numbers of hormones, and ants achieve the same thing independently using pheromones. 90% of communication in eusocial insects occurs chemically. The picture I've just got off to the left here, this is the William Morton Wheeler lab at Harvard. This is actually E.O. Wilson's lab. And it's interesting because Harvard is very big into tradition, despite the fact that William Morton Wheeler worked in this lab 100 years ago. His name is actually still on the door. E.O. Wilson has not actually removed it from the ant lab, which has the largest collection of ants in the world. The other question that might kind of arise here is, why are there pictures of cats all over the window? And the reason for that is the curator in the lab, Stephen Cover. When I was there visiting for about a week and a half, a number of years ago, was currently obsessed with cats. And he just wanted to talk cats. When he wasn't talking ants, he needed to talk cats. And what's interesting is that Stephen seems to kind of go through various phases of interests. I know the Williams Lake Naturalists have had Bruce Archibald give talks on fossils in British Columbia. And Bruce did some work in this lab some while back before I was there. At that time, Stephen was obsessed with orchids. And so there were orchids all over the labs and pictures of orchids everywhere else. In any event, we have this superorganism concept that is actually a useful way to think about ant colonies and eusocial insect colonies. So this is perhaps a strange picture to kind of follow the last with, but one of the central issues that kind of arises when we're talking about cooperative behavior between individuals is the concept of altruism, this selfless behavior in which we might actually give up resources to another individual, or might even risk our lives to save the life of another individual. When we think about aspects of evolution, superficially at least, this is something which can be a little problematic, because if somebody puts their life at risk to save someone else, they can't continue to reproduce and pass their genes on to subsequent generations. And so this behavior, and this highly cooperative behavior that we see within eusocial insects, has garnered a lot of interest, going right back to the days of Darwin. And so our sort of definition of what we call altruism is the giving of resources, energy, food, shelter, reproductive rights, or taking of risks, or even giving your life for another, is defined as being altruistic. And because in evolution, we talk about natural selection, and we tend to initially state that it's graded with respect to the number of offspring that can be generated and association with any given attribute. And you could replace attribute with gene or alleles. Altruism needs a bit more thought, because altruistic losses should actually reduce that grade for an individual, that's ability to pass on those alleles and those genes. And this was something which actually initially bothered Charles Darwin. And so here's a painting of Charles Darwin, 43 years, I think, before he published The Origin of Species. But he specifically talked about social insects as initially causing him some concern as to whether he understood evolution and natural selection at all correctly. And as he stated in The Origin of Species, I will confine myself to one special difficulty, which at first appeared to me to be insuperable and actually fatal to my whole theory. And I allude to the neuters or sterile females in insect communities. For these neuters often differ widely in instinct and in structure from both the male and fertile females, and yet being sterile, they can't propagate their own kind. Okay, so that's problematic in the concept of passing on their genes. But then he went on to say, the difficulty, though appearing insuperable, is lessened, or as I believe, disappears, when it is remembered that selection could be applied to the family as well as to the individual, and thus gain the desired end. So this was 50 years before William Morton Wheeler kind of formally described eusocial insects as being a superorganism. But Darwin was recognizing that natural selection could operate in a manner other than simply focusing on the individual. And the survival of that colony could be what's interacting with natural selection. Now, that ability to sort of survive was often coined in the term of fitness. And of course, Charles Darwin's cousin, Herbert Spencer, 5 years after the publication of The Origin of Species, was a person who sort of coined the term survival of the fittest, which when it is utilized in that really constrained manner seems to be referring again to individuals. And as a consequence, again, is a little problematic in explaining exactly how eusocial insects come to be in the way that they are. Spencer, of course, for those of you who are familiar with history and biology, is also deeply entangled with the whole concept of social Darwinism, which led to the eugenics movement at the beginning of the 20th century. Philosophers argue over this endlessly, but he's quite a controversial figure biologically. So, in considering how we can consider that sort of natural selection is operating at a level other than the individual, when we're thinking about survival of the fittest, we have sort of one contribution here by JBS Haldane, which kind of put it in a really simple context when it talks about how you pass genes on from one generation to the next. So he kind of posed the question, would you give your life for your brother? And his answer to this was no, but I would for 2 brothers or 8 cousins. And so what he meant by this was that if you gave your life for 2 brothers, which each share 50% of your alleles, then you are ensuring an equivalent movement of your genes into subsequent generations. And because cousins are share a more distant, a lesser quantity, I guess 12.5% of your alleles, you'd only risk your life for about 8 cousins. And so the closer your relatives are to you, the more you're sort of willing to behave altruistically towards them. A term that we would later refer to as inclusive fitness. So not fitness of the individual, but inclusive of the family unit that it belongs to. W.D. Hamilton in 1964 actually put a really simple equation to this concept of inclusive fitness, in which he kind of defined the benefits of altruism as a function of just how closely individuals were related to those that they were giving up resources to. And in particular, Hamilton noted something very particular about ants, bees, and wasps that really helped to bring the concept of inclusive fitness into sort of greater strength. And it had to do with the way that they reproduced through what we call haplodiploidy. In the photo at the bottom here, just got a nice little photograph here of a queen ant being fertilized by a male. And just as a general note, this is actually kind of a common size disparity for males and queens in many species of ants. So haplodiploidy, without going into all of this in any detail, the sex of the hymenopterans, the ants, the bees, and the wasps, is determined by their chromosome number, kind of. I won't split that here, but males only have 1 set of chromosomes, and females have 2 sets of chromosomes. So if a queen decides not to fertilize the eggs that she's producing, they will develop into males. And if she fertilizes them, they will develop into female workers, or they might develop into virgin queens. And I should say that in sort of the classic ant, and in many cases the other eusocial insects as well, the queens will mate only once, and they will store the sperm for the rest of their lives. So in the case of ants and carpenter ants, they can store that sperm for 25 years and continue to produce fertilized eggs and new workers and new virgin queens as needed. And they can also produce, of course, males if they simply choose not to fertilize those eggs. So whenever you see ants out and about and foraging, you're looking entirely at females. They do all of the work within the colony. And because of this haplodiploidy, they're 75% related to each other. So they share most of their genes, but they're only 50% related to their brothers. Those are the males. And the males actually don't contribute anything to the colony. They don't work. They usually, in most species, are only produced just before reproduction is going to occur. And once a mating flight has occurred, any male that is stupid enough to have not left with the others is usually killed by their sisters. They don't really have a great deal of tolerance for these, for males, which have failed to perform the one job that they expect of them. So haplodiploidy is thought to strengthen inclusive fitness because the females within the colony are more closely related to each other than is typical for most animal species. However, haplodiploidy isn't an absolute requirement for becoming eusocial. So first of all, lots of haplodiploid insects, most bees and wasps, are solitary, despite the fact that they are haplodiploid. And the termites have advanced eusocial behavior, but they are not haplodiploid. So haplodiploidy appears to kind of smooth the path towards becoming eusocial, but it's still a fairly difficult path in the sense that most species will not move the full way down towards becoming eusocial. Once they do, there are enormous advantages, but it's still a rough and bumpy road, but becoming haplodiploid or being haplodiploid does make it easier. However, if you're not haplodiploid, you can still make that same journey to becoming eusocial, but it's going to be more challenging and less common. And as a consequence, most eusocial insects are the hymenopterans. They are haplodiploid, but they're not exclusively. Eusocial insects are not exclusively haplodiploid. Now, just kind of quickly, just following through a little bit of the history here. It was E.O. Wilson in 1975 who published Sociobiology, which kind of took all of that earlier work, which was looking at the foundations of social behavior, not just in eusocial insects, but in other animals, whether it's wolves or other social animals, naked mole rats, and kind of created a single discipline. Or it created a theoretical framework that to encompass all of these types of different social behavior. And interestingly, social biology became a discipline unto itself, and many universities developed entire departments strictly in social biology. And social biology also led to some other sort of interesting examinations of social insects. One of which was to come from a student of E.O. Wilson's, Robert Trivers. Trivers is another one of these individuals who probably, if you were to talk about his life, would encompass a talk entirely unto itself. Robert Trivers, Caucasian, yet for a period of time, a member of the Black Panthers in the United States, has written on extensively different aspects of social behavior, including behavior within the cockpit of airplanes, leading to airplane crashes. And yet very strangely and ironically appears incapable of understanding really fundamental human social behavior. He has a tendency to say things which are distinctly misogynist. He seems to be from a different generation. For someone who studies social behavior, he is remarkably inept. And as a consequence, in the last few years, has been pretty much banned from talking to most university groups as a consequence. But Trivers took some of the predictions of sociobiology and wanted to understand a little bit more about eusocial insects. In particular, he recognized in haplodiploid insects that there was a conflict within the colony with respect to how genes would be passed from one generation to the other, because queens would have a preferred ratio of males and females that would differ from the female workers. So from the queen's perspective, it would make sense for her to invest equally energetically in males and females because each are 50% related to her. But from the perspective of the female workers, it would make more sense for them to pass on their alleles. And remember, they've given up a lot. They can't reproduce themselves. And as a consequence, they're depending upon that queen to pass on alleles on their behalf. And So do those workers exert an influence on the queen to cause her to produce more females than males? Because that would make sense from their evolutionary perspective. And Rivers was the first person to study this. So he took a look at this conflict between workers and the queens, and he wanted to know who is calling the shots. Investment in offspring, male and female offspring, reproductive offspring should be 1-to-1 if the queen is calling the shots, and it should be more females than males if the workers are calling the shots. And this is what he found, and you can kind of see over here. Apologies, I didn't have a higher resolution version of this. But when you take a look at the weight ratio of females to males being produced within colonies for different species of ants, you find that in every instance, it's greater than 1, sometimes much greater than 1. So who's calling the shots within the colony? It looks like the workers are calling the shots. They've given up a lot by giving up their reproductive potential directly, but they are exerting an influence on the queen, which is quite profound, and skewing her production of reproductives to what they would like to see, as opposed to what the queen would like to see. So social biology really kind of led into a very quantitative analysis of behaviors within eusocial animals. And here, just to kind of illustrate this relationship between the females and males within a colony. So what we have here is the red imported fire ant. And this is a flood adapted species native to South America, Argentina. And when the floodplains in which they normally live are flooded, they are lifted out of their below ground colonies, and they become buoyant, and they form these rafts, which will float on the surface of the floodwaters. And these rafts will float around for days at a time until they kind of wash up on the receding floodwaters along the shoreline, and they will start a new colony there. And of course, the red imported fire ant has been introduced into New Orleans in the 1940s and has spread extensively through the southern United States, California, Texas, Louisiana, Florida. Anybody who's been down there into parks or even urban areas, you've almost certainly encountered the red imported fire ant. So back to this female male conflict. So as I mentioned, males are tolerated to a certain point. And on these rafts, which are formed by the interlaced bodies of the females, the males are also found. But if this raft is floating for more than 24 hours, the energetics of being in this raft start to become problematic. And the first thing that they do in order to improve their survival is they throw all of the males overboard. So 24 hours, if they haven't found good land to start a new colony, the males are just kind of declared superfluous and they are tossed. They're not genetically related to each other to the same extent that the females are to each other, and hence they're the first to go. And as a note, with the flooding which is occurring, regularly in southern United States, when New Orleans flooded and Hurricane Katrina, and so many people found themselves stranded on the roofs of their houses. Not only was that an incredibly desperate and truly dire condition that they found themselves in, but many of those families that were stranded on the roofs suddenly discovered that a raft of fire ants had washed up against the tiles, and they found themselves sharing that roof with a colony of fire ants. And these are really aggressive, unpleasant ants to deal with. So let's just talk a little bit about the main three we think of when we think of eusocial insects. And these are the ants, the bees, and the wasps. So this is a genetic or phylogenetic tree, the most recent, looking at the relationship between various types of stinging wasps, stinging Hymenoptera. And we can see the true wasps up here, the vespids. The asterisk indicates that eusocial species are found within the group. You can see most of these don't have eusocials. And down here, we find the Formicidae, the ants, which are eusocial, and we also find the bees, which are also marked with an asterisk, which are also eusocial. So first of all, if you're wondering evolutionarily, what group the ants are most closely related to, they're actually related most closely to the sphecoform wasps and the bees. The sphecoform wasps are the thread-waisted wasps. They're not hard to find. If you kind of sweeping a net over tree leaves, you come across these wasps kind of quite frequently. So you'll notice that there's two colors in this slide. One is blue, one is red. And what this marks is a difference in the reproductive, or I should say the life history strategy of these groups. The ones that are marked in red indicate species in which the larvae are kept in one location, often aggregated, and the queen or the parents bring the food to the larvae. And the ones that are marked in blue are parasitoids, in which they take the larvae or the egg to the prey. For all the ones which are blue, they'll fly, they'll find a prey organism, they'll lay an egg on it, or they'll drop a larva on it, and that larva will consume that host as a food source. The ones that are in red, all the larvae are kept in one location, and the food is brought to them. And you can see right off the bat, of the ones which are eusocial, the wasps, the bees, and the ants, they are all of a group in which fundamentally they bring food to the larvae rather than vice versa. You'll notice there's one group here, the spider wasps, which also have the same behavior of bringing food to the larvae, but none of them have actually become eusocial, but some of them are close. They have some weak social behavior, which is sort of rudimentarily towards becoming sort of eusocial. So this is one attribute in the life cycle which lends itself towards becoming eusocial, that there is an aggregation of young in one location, and the food is brought towards them rather than vice versa. So besides haplodiploidy, what kind of promotes becoming eusocial? These are these attributes, and this is largely what explains how termites, we believe, came to become eusocial, even though they're not haplodiploid, and how that one species of ambrosia beetle did this, and how some aphids and thrips did this. They seem to be associated with species that bring food to the nest, right? Just mentioned that. The nests are often associated with high quality resources that are worth monopolizing. This is true in the case of the aphids, the ambrosia beetles, and the termites. They tend to be fairly slow development, which means that there has to be sort of constant support for them. The females can lay eggs repeatedly, what we refer to as being iteroparous. They're monogamous. There's a high risk if they disperse, and there's a chance that the offspring can inherit the nest. So there's an advantage to that. And there's also an advantage to being capable of being capable of group defense. And as a note, when we look at the eusocial insects, another attribute that I didn't mention, they're all stinging. That is, fundamentally, they all have a stinger, and individually, they're capable of defending themselves. And as a group, they're even more capable of doing so. So we think that these are the reasons why we have seen eusocial behavior arise in species that are not haplodiploid. Okay, so within the hymenopterans, we do have these three main groups. We have our wasps, we have our bees, and we have the ants, which have all become eusocial. The ants are the only group in which, as a taxon, they're all eusocial. Most wasps, vespids, are solitary. Most bees are solitary. So within the wasps, or the eusocial wasps that we have sort of three main groups. We have the yellow jackets, the paper wasps, and the hornets. And initially, let me just kind of discount the hornets. We actually have no hornets in British Columbia, with one exception. And if you quickly object, what about the bald-faced hornet? The bald-faced hornet is actually a yellow jacket. That's just not yellow. So the bald-faced hornet technically is a yellow jacket. So by and large, as far as native species goes in British Columbia, we have yellow jackets and we have paper wasps. And another thing about the common names that sometimes will drive me entomologists a little crazy. Paper wasps are most notable in not wrapping their honeycomb in, or not wrapping their larval cells in paper. The yellow jackets do, but the paper wasps do not. So whenever in order to distinguish a paper wasp nest, if you find a bare number of cells, horizontally sort of oriented, maybe 20 to 50 cells for the larvae, those are paper wasps. Paper wasps tend to be a little more slender than yellow jackets. And if you can see them in flight well enough, you can see that they have long legs that kind of drag behind them in the air as they fly. We've got 2 native species of paper wasps in British Columbia, but unfortunately the European paper wasp is starting to become, which is invasive, has been spreading. It's been causing a lot of problems for cherry and grape production in the Okanagan, because the European paper wasp likes to chew away the skin of the grapes and the cherries and causes a fair bit of damage. The one, of course, that most people are familiar with are the yellow jackets. And I'm going to make a prediction here on yellow jackets. I'm going to predict that this is going to be a bad year for yellow jackets. So yellow jackets, in a way that's different than ants, these colonies arise and collapse on an annual basis. So we have mated queens that overwinter by themselves in a solitary condition. And when we get a really harsh, cold winter, we get a lot of mortality to those overwintering queens. And as a consequence, the following year, we do not see a lot of yellow jackets. This year, in most of British Columbia, we've had a really mild year, and mortality of those overwintering queens was likely quite low. And I only know in my own backyard, when I was pulling out some lawn furniture a couple of weeks ago, I found 2 overwintering common yellow jackets, Dolichospila vulgaris, which were doing quite well. And I have a feeling generally overall, they're going to be doing quite well. So their colonies are going to be building up over the summer. And as we kind of head towards mid to late summer and autumn, these are probably going to be a bigger pest than they are in typical years as a consequence of this past winter. People fear yellow jackets. Many of them are quite aggressive. The Western yellow jacket, the German yellow jacket, the common yellow jacket. It would be nice if we could distinguish yellow jackets from each other, because we have one whole group of yellow jackets, what's called the Fusca group, which are really quite mild. And they never go after sugars, which means they never bother people when they're out sitting at a picnic table. And for the last couple of years, I've had a colony of these yellow jackets, prairie yellow jackets, actually living in some ornamental stone in my backyard. And they have been perfectly fine to cohabit with. They're not aggressive, they don't cause any problems, and they remove tons of pests, from the surrounding area. But unfortunately, yellow jackets are viewed with horror by many people, and as soon as people see them, especially on their property, they go to great pains to destroy those colonies. Now the hornets, as I mentioned, we don't actually have any true hornets in North America. At least not native to North America, but in Eastern North America, the European hornet has become well established. It's a fairly large hornet. And the European hornet actually turned up 2 years ago on Vancouver Island. And I haven't heard of any records since then. But the other hornet that, of course, most people have heard about in the news are the murder hornets, the giant Asian hornet, Vespa mandarinia. So this is the one that turned up in the Nanaimo a couple of years ago, to great concern. And in fact, a friend of mine who has been sort of coordinating the efforts to eradicate this hornet. In Nanaimo, the colony that this came from was destroyed. Another colony was found in Washington State last year. But kind of behind the scenes, we have found a couple of other species of these as well. But only individuals have been located. There are quite actually a number of different species of giant Asian hornets, and a few have turned up. And so there's quite a bit of ongoing surveillance right now to try and eradicate these. The hornets are a concern for the honeybee industry because they will definitely attack honeybee hives. Although where they are found in Asia, typically you can use an excluder bar. Because of their large size, if you use an excluder bar, the bottom of the hives, that will generally kind of keep them out of the hives because they're too big to get through. So there are some sort of remedies for dealing with this, but of course their large size and the fact that they can be aggressive and they have a very painful sting. 12 stings will kill a rat. That's actually pretty potent. And so, people, of course, are kind of horrified with the idea of being attacked, by an insect this large. But we don't know of any colonies currently in British Columbia for sure, but I wouldn't be surprised if we do see some more turn up from time to time. There's general concern that they have been deliberately introduced into British Columbia, and that might continue. And the reason for that is that in some areas in Asia, they are used for food. And so some people like to eat giant hornets. So the eusocial bees. Interestingly, when we think of bees and they're enormously abundant, so many of them are actually solitary. And while there are some variations on eusociality in bees, really, we've kind of just got the bumblebees and the honeybees. And with respect to the bumblebees, we got maybe 30 or so species within the province. And with respect to honeybees, well, actually, we have no native species of honeybee. There's only 8 species of honeybee in the world. But of course, we have introduced the European or Western honeybee into North America. And that's often the honeybee, of course, that most people sort of encounter. The picture that I'm sort of using here, I've always found, kind of interesting when I'm talking to entomology classes, introduce honeybees. So this is a cave painting from about 8,000 years ago, showing somebody with a basket climbing up into a tree and reaching into a honeybee nest to presumably collect honey from the colony. So humans have had an association with honeybees for truly a very, very long period of time. Now, with respect to the comments about bumblebees, they are eusocial, but their colonies are fairly small. Usually there's about 50 or 100 bees within a bumblebee colony. And where they like to set up their nests, they like to use abandoned mouse burrows. And you would think it would be deer mice because they would be the most native and ubiquitous. But at our entomology conferences the last couple of years, there's been a researcher who's been looking at bumblebees. And for some reason, they seem to be attracted to house mouse urine more than deer mice. But regardless, that's where they prefer to set up their colonies in the abandoned burrows of mice. And of course, they are important pollinators, as are honeybees. But when we're talking about pollination, that's what we tend to think about when we talk about bees. We've got to give credit to the enormous number of solitary bees. So I can talk about there being about 100 species of ants in the province of British Columbia. But when you're looking at bees, sometimes you can get close to 100 species of bees, in a space of a radius of 50 kilometers, of most locations in the province. And so many of those solitary bees are targeted to very specific species of flowering plant. And unless you happen to be there when that plant is flowering, you never actually see the bee that's involved in pollination. So those are the eusocial bees, the bumblebees and the Western honeybee. So there are varying degrees of being eusocial. So here is a depiction, picture of leafcutter ants. We have this enormous variation in the different castes within the colony. We've got this really large soldier at the top here and one of the smaller minor workers at the bottom. In leafcutter nests, The nests can be easily the size of a single family residence. So if you imagine sort of a single story typical home, if you kind of sunk that into the ground, that would be the size of a leafcutter ant colony. They're truly quite vast. With really well-developed trophallaxis, and that is the ability to pass food from the mouth of one ant to the mouth of another, so that the workers which collect food can pass that food on to others that it encounters. One notable thing about ant colonies, adult workers, whether that small miner, which is shown here, or that soldier on top, cannot eat solid food. They require all of their food in a liquid form. And so when solid food is collected by a colony, it's taken back to the colony and it's fed to the larvae. The larvae are the only life history stage which is capable of consuming and eating solid food. The larvae then regurgitate through trophallaxis the food to the other members of the colony. So the larvae function is the stomach in ant colonies. So leafcutter ants are highly eusocial. Weakly eusocial ants would include the Dracula ants, which many of you have heard me talk about before. These are found on Vancouver Island and some of the Gulf Islands. The colonies are quite small. They appear to specialize in attacking a very specific type of centipede, although one amateur ant keeper discovered that they will also readily consume drywood termites as a food source, which is something which has actually not been reported in the literature. But these ants will take that solid food, whether it's a centipede or a termite, and will take it back to the larvae, and the larvae will consume that solid food. In the Dracula ants, however, there's no trophallaxis. They have not evolved that capacity, so the larvae cannot regurgitate the food that it has digested to the workers or to the queen. And as a consequence, the way that they get around this and why they're called Dracula ants is because these ants will then bite the larvae and cause them to bleed, and they will feed on the blood or the hemolymph of the larvae because they don't know how to do anything else. And I had a live colony sent to me from a collector on Vancouver Island. And it's quite interesting. You can see the scars on the larvae where the adults have been feeding on them. That doesn't normally kill the larvae. The larvae are bled regularly for the purpose of this. Again, weakly eusocial, if you disturb the nest, the adults will scatter. They won't try to defend the larvae. It's every ant for itself. Within these colonies. How altruistic are some eusocial species? Well, they will certainly give up their lives in defense of their colonies. I've just got this picture here. Ordell had mentioned I've been working with European fire ants in the lower mainland. And this is an interesting photograph. These are laziest, kind of common lawn ants on a first encounter with European fire ants, which are in red. And you'll notice, if you can quite tell from this picture, that the laziest ants are alive, the black ants, and the red ants are dead. In fact, one of them has had its head removed. And so the fire ants have been killed by these common lawn ants. And we had observed this a number of times, that on first encounter, our native species of ants would stand up for themselves and kill the fire ants. But every time that we came back to check on the situation a few days or a week later, it was only fire ants. So fire ants would occasionally lose these battles, but they would always win the war, given a little bit more time. To what degree will they be altruistic? At the bottom here, I noticed that in Borneo, there's a species of carpenter ant that has these really enlarged salivary glands. And when they encounter an attacking ant, they will clamp onto it and they will compress those mandibular glands, causing their heads to explode. And they will spread that sticky secretion all over the attacking ant, kind of hindering its ability to move and allowing other ants of its own colony to kind of swarm in and then kill it. In some ways, some of the termites have found a better way to do this. The Formosan termite, which is found in New Orleans. In the soldiers, they actually have a big glue gun on their heads. You have these big mandibles, but then there's this big central nozzle on the forehead. And when they encounter a marauding ant or another termite, that glue gun is used for the same purpose, but it doesn't require the death of the termite to do so. Being cooperative, of course, in a eusocial organism sort of allows for cooperative hunting. This was a picture when we were collecting in Borneo of leptogynes ants, which were attacking a small pill bug. And these ants actually kind of roam through the forest in little wolf packs, you know, of about 20, 40 ants. They're quite vicious. They have a really quite spectacular sting. And whenever they encounter or come across prey, they swarm it and then try to recruit other members to that. And I remember one night we were walking through the tropical rainforest on the way back to the bunkhouse. And one of our Australian colleagues had decided that flip-flops were suitable, you know, for kind of walking through tropical rainforest at night. And somebody stopped to look at something ahead. And so we all stopped, and lo and behold, leptogynes ants found his feet. And he discovered why flip-flops were not a great footwear for a tropical rainforest. Okay. He kind of screamed in a pretty startling way. Eusocial behavior as well can lead to, beyond what I'm talking about in ants, really elegant behavior in honeybees. And of course, most people have heard of the waggle dance. And when bees return from a food resource and they come back to the hive, they will often initiate in this waggle dance, which provides two pieces of really important information. The length of the waggle, and by proxy, how long it takes to go through the waggle, it gives an indication of the distance to the food source. So a 1 second sort of waggle is indicates the food is about 1 kilometer away. And the deviation or the angle of the waggle on the vertical hive face is the same angle that the food source is to the sun. And so other bees will push up against the bees which are undergoing a waggle dance. There's often an exchange of nectar, so they're getting a sense of the species of flowering plant that they're looking for and its quality. And the waggle itself is giving them this directional and distance information that they can utilize to find those food resources. And of course, this is something, you know, which really, you know, that when we talk about cooperative social behavior in a manner which is strictly not just reproductive, this is probably one of the most elegant examples within a eusocial species. We've talked about the, you know, for people who are familiar with biology or insects, they've heard about the waggle dance for years. I should say that there is still out there a group of entomologists who are adamantly opposed to the belief that the waggle dance means anything whatsoever. One of the other attributes that come from eusocial behavior is slavery. So when you have a group which is bonded together socially by chemical cues, it can be subverted. And we have slave-taking species of ants. In fact, I have one which is living just in my next door neighbor's yard, which last year was frequently attacking and taking a colony of taking a colony of formica ants out of my lawn as slaves on a nightly basis. So what will happen in these ants is that a queen of these red ants, sort of shown here, Polyergus mexicanus, will enter a colony of this slave species, will kill their queen and will take over. She will start to lay eggs, which the other ants recognize as sisters rather than a completely separate species. The slave-taking ants won't do any work at all within the slaves do all the nest maintenance and food collection. But when the slaves begin to die out, in order to kind of keep the situation going, they will begin to engage in slave raids. And so they will find adjacent colonies of the suitable slave species, they will attack it, and they will carry off the larvae and the pupae and bring it back to their nests so that they have an ongoing supply of newly formed slaves. And as I mentioned, I saw this occurring nightly, in my front lawn last year, and it'll probably start again pretty soon. And what's interesting about this is it normally occurs between 4 and 6 p.m. In the evening. So eusocial insects will pretty much take on anything. And so this is, again, another example from Borneo. This is a giant carpenter ant, which is latched onto the hand of a colleague of mine, Andy Suarez. And what was interesting about this, beside the fact that apparently was genuinely painful, and I was certainly careful to avoid these ants, we could not get that ant off Andy's hand. Everybody was hot and sweaty, and it wouldn't come loose. And it finally came off this way, utilizing a pair of pliers. So that kind of gives you a range of sort of ideas of this eusocial and defensive behavior, which eusocial species are capable of. It's not all aggression and horror, when working with these insects. Of course, people who work with honeybees, can collect the honey. And occasionally when you work on fire ants, people give you candy. So it's not all bad. So with that, and I realize now I've been talking for an hour, my apologies. I meant to be wrapped up like 15 minutes ago. I will end it right there. Thanks, everybody.